Pourquoi environ 90% des mots politiques trouvent-ils leur origine dans la langue française? That's the correct grammar. So what he's asking is that why is it that about 90% of political terms and words originate in the French language? Why is it so? That's the question. Now, is it true that 90% of political terminology, words, vocabulary, etc., originates in the French language? I don't think it's 90%. I think it's not entirely accurate to say that 90% of all these terms come from French. Now, French definitely has had a very significant influence on political terminology, especially on English political terminology, okay, and other European languages also. But even other languages like Latin and Greek have significantly influenced English political terminology. So, if you look back historically, why French has been influential on English, on the English language, it all goes back to the Norman conquest of England, 1066 AD. An invader who was called William the Bastard, okay, he was the Duke of Normandy, the fourth or fifth descendant of Rollo the Viking. That guy invaded England. He became the last foreigner to successfully invade and conquer England. And he became known as William the Conqueror. And as a consequence of his conquest of England, Norman French became the language of the ruling class in England for several centuries. And it has left a lasting impact on English vocabulary, especially in governance and law and administration and all that. So the modern English language is a Germanic language. You know, originally it was influenced by the Saxons and later by the Normans, both Germanic peoples. And Norman French was also a Germanic based language. Then so that's the Norman invasion thing. Okay, then you had the French Revolution, late 18th century. So the political ideas and structures that came out of this revolution introduced a bunch of terms in political discourse in Europe and eventually globally. And some of these terms that came out of this revolution were révolution, citoyen, which means citizen, constitution, which is constitution, république, which is republic, sovereignty, liberté, égalité, fraternité, all these words, French words, okay? They all became embedded in English eventually. And then for centuries, French was the language of diplomacy. It was called the lingua franca, which was the French language. It was the language of diplomacy, international relations, and it was the language that was used in all courts in Europe, royal courts in Europe. And because of this, French terms like ambassador, diplomacy, protocol, and so on, these French terms came into widespread use across the diplomatic world. Okay, so you had so many such French terms, French origin terms that became widely used in political terminology. But you have political terminology in the English language that also draws from Latin and Greek, from the Latin language and the Greek language. For example, in the US, you have the Senate. Well, the original Senate was a Roman Senate, right? Veto was a Roman term. Legislature probably was a Roman term, so Latin term. And from the Greek language, you have words like democracy, tyranny, oligarchy, plutocracy, blah, 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 all of that. So overall political discourse has been influenced by the French language to a large extent, and also by Latin and Greek. I'm talking about in the English language and in the Western world. And you may have words from other languages also. So I wouldn't say that 90% of the terminology comes from French, but a significant portion certainly does come from French.